Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. So, today's episode, we're diving into an essential aspect of the college application process, which is the college interview. It might seem very daunting to a lot of students, but today we have a very special guest to walk us through the interview process, including what admissions officers are looking for, the types of interviews, and how to prepare. So, welcome to the show, Mustafa. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Yeah. So before we start, I'm sure our listeners are very curious about who you are because this is our first time appearing on a podcast. So maybe let's just walk us through your background and what you do at
Sure.
InGenius Prep.
Sure. I used to work at Carnegie Mellon University, which is, I think most people know, which is based in Pittsburgh. But they also have a campus in Qatar in the Middle East. I don't know if many people know about that. I worked for both campuses in Pittsburgh as well as Qatar. I was the Associate Director of Admission. I'm also an alumni of the university, so I also studied business administration at CMU. And right after that, I started working for them in admissions. So I worked there for about 9 years, and then I left that a while ago to pursue a few different things. One thing is, I think, just probably going to be a little bit different, is that I was quite passionate about the Persian language. So I ended up going to Iran to actually learn Persian. So now I'm fluent in Persian, and I work in different parts of the education sector as well. With InGenius Prep, I'm a former admissions officer, and I help advise students on what colleges to apply to, what their essays should be like, their extracurricular activities, help shape their application depending on when they start working with us. So that's a
Nice.
little bit about me.
Nice. That's very impressive. I like that you completely learned a new language from scratch. That's very hard.
I've been interested in like Persian literature and poetry for a long time, and just one thing led to another, and an opportunity came up. So it was a great experience. Yeah, yeah.
So, I know a lot of students are going through this process of wanting to find out more about college interviews. Let's just start with the basics. What is the
Right.
overall purpose of a college interview? How does that fit into the admissions process?
Sure. What it allows us to do, what it allows an admissions officer to do, is to get to know a student in a way that's different from the rest of their application. It's like a one on one interaction that you're having with the student. So you really get to assess their personality, their communication skills, how well they can maybe communicate, their confidence level. In addition to that, how well they may fit into the institution. So there's many different things that we're looking for in an interview, and it gives a student a chance to learn more about the university as well. It gives them a chance to ask questions about the school, maybe even get guidance on their application directly from an admissions counselor if they're the ones that are doing the interview. So overall, it just complements the whole holistic review process. It's balancing things from the academic side with personal traits. And one thing I think many people maybe don't realize is that it's also a chance for the admission staff to really market the school to the student. Admissions people know that students are being bombarded with messages from different universities and colleges. So that this opportunity, when we get to speak to them, it's really also a way for us to attract the student towards the university. So it's not just a one-way street, it's really a two-way street between the student and the admission officer.
That's interesting. I know you mentioned about personality traits earlier. When conducting a college interview, what are some of the top qualities or traits that
Mhm.
admissions officers look for in a candidate?
So there's something that you might hear me repeating throughout today's podcast, and that's passion. That's one of the key things I think, at least when I was interviewing students, how passionate is the student about this program? How authentic and genuine is their interest in what they want to study and their future goals and academic aspirations? So that's one big part of it, is really understanding, apart from their fit into the program, how well they really understand the program and how passionate they are about it. In addition to that, it could be things like how confident they are, how engaging they can be. And we just really want to see a person who would be a valuable addition to the community. The interview then really helps the student also express all those things and talk about experiences and abilities. Those are all the different things that I think make a good interview.
So now let's break down the different types of college interviews. I know from my own research, there's two main ones, evaluative and
Mm.
informational, but could you walk us through the differences between the two? Are there any more than these types of interviews out there?
There might be a sort of third category, which is in between this. But evaluative interviews, universities will invite students for an interview. It's typically a bit more formal. We're really assessing the student on a formal basis. We might be taking notes, and it can influence the admission decision. And this is quite common with many selective schools. The second type of interviews are the one that you mentioned is informational interviews. These are less formal. They really serve as an opportunity for the student to learn about the school. They can get insights into the school and the culture. They don't necessarily directly impact the admission decisions. They can definitely add to it. And they're typically conducted by, let's say, an alumni or another admissions representative. The third one is sometimes universities allow students to request for interviews themselves. Carnegie Mellon used to do that when I was back in admissions. They no longer do that anymore. But that I think was a really great way for students to really learn more about the university and for us to learn about them as well. It was an optional thing that they could schedule on their own. I think some universities may still offer that, but it's becoming less of a thing now.
Would you say pre-recorded interviews are becoming more common these days, or is it still like a
Right.
hybrid between in-person, virtual, and like pre-recorded?
Yeah, that's another type of interview would be a pre-recorded interview. So it's still a mixture between all of these. Students will get different messages from different universities. It can really vary a lot. So with in-person interviews, there will be in-person as the name applies. Usually it's on campus. Sometimes it will be maybe on location near your school. They really allow for better face-to-face interaction. You really get to know the student better. There's like more body language going into their eye contact. So as you can imagine, it is a more interactive type of interview. But virtual interviews, I think those have become quite common, especially after COVID and how everything has gone online more and more. It's also a really great opportunity for students who can't make it to campus or who may be living like in another country for them to be interviewed virtually online. And I think those can vary as well. They could be formal, they could be informal, like we discussed. The pre-recorded ones, I think those are maybe less rare. Sometimes they are required for international students where universities want to know how good a student's English is. So they may ask them to pre-record something and they may have a time limit with questions that have been sent to them from before. But that gives them flexibility. It gives them an opportunity to really polish their speaking skills. They can do multiple tries at it, I think. So
Mhm.
those are the sort of different ways interviews are being done.
So now that we've covered the basics of it, what should the student actually focus on? Are there specific things they should research about the school beforehand?
There's two things that a student needs to focus on. One is themselves, their personal strengths and experiences and goals and all their different achievements that they've done. So there's a lot of self-analysis that needs to go into this, self-research, I would say. Sit down and write all the different achievements that you have, all your activities, all your strengths that you can think of. When it comes to the school side of it, definitely before they walk into the interview room and before they speak to the admissions person, they should spend a significant amount of time learning about the school. And there's different things that they can focus on there. Things like the school's mission, the values, but I think also the programs and what makes the programs unique, especially the program that the student is interested in. In addition to that, clubs and organizations at the university that a student may be interested in and wanting, maybe considering joining if they get admitted to the university. You can look at things like famous alumni that have graduated from the university. You can learn about them. It could be things like buildings on campus, and then also mentions of the university in the news recently in terms of maybe research or innovation. So as much information as you can find out about the school that you're interested in and the program, I think that will be really helpful for a student.
I know going through the interview process as a young student, what's the best way to start practicing? Because I know sometimes the nerves would get to them. So, should
Right.
students lean on to maybe like mock interviews, or was self reflection enough to prepare?
They do have the opportunity to do mock interviews, and definitely, I think they should take those opportunities. The more they get to practice their speaking skills in front of someone else, the better they'll perform in a real interview. And they can ask their school counselors, their friends, their parents, anyone who may be interested in doing those sort of interviews with them. They could consider recording themselves if they really want to really refine their speaking skills, for example. But self-reflection is definitely something they have to do. But if they can do a few practice interviews, that would be a very helpful activity for them. Definitely.
A lot of people are very interested in
Mm.
this. When it comes to common interview questions, are they usually more focused on the student's achievements or do they focus more on like personality and fit? Let's go through maybe some examples you have.
It's a balance of all of those things that you mentioned. They are looking for personality, they are looking for achievements. So, some of the more typical questions could be like, tell me about yourself. And that's just like an introductory question to open the interview. That's pretty common. One of the most key questions is why do they want to attend this college? And why do they want to, for example, study that program? And these are two separate things, although they're very much connected. But I think knowing enough about the college and the program, it's important. Sometimes people may know a lot about the college, but they may not properly understand what the program is about. For example, sometimes when I would interview students applying to computer science, a lot of times they would maybe end up talking about IT or something related to computers, but not necessarily computer science itself, which showed that they hadn't fully understood what the program is about. It's just important that they focus on understanding the program and the college. Other questions that are common: what are your academic and career goals? So you do want to prepare for that, have an idea of what you may want to do in the future. I've definitely interviewed students who didn't really have an answer for that. They would just say, I don't know, I just want to come to university. But then there are other students who have really prepared well for that and they know exactly what they want to do. You don't necessarily have to know exactly what you want to do, but have some idea of and be able to answer the question. There's other questions like, what do you like to do in your spare time? Could be unexpected questions like, what's a book that you've read recently? Let's talk about that. And then, of course, there are questions about their extracurricular engagement and what achievements they've had. And those are all the different sort of different questions that a student can get.
I know you mentioned the iconic and classic question, tell me about yourself. How should students answer this without sounding too rehearsed or too scripted?
So you don't want to necessarily memorize answers. You may want to just have bullet points and things so that you're able to naturally speak about those things. You can have a structured response to that. You could just cover a little bit about your background, maybe if you've grown up in another country or somewhere else. You can briefly cover like your academic interests, talk a little bit about your extracurriculars and aspirations. So it doesn't need to be a very long answer. It's just a really brief sort of introduction when you want to introduce yourself to someone. And you just want to keep it concise, but also engaging as well at the same time.
So, when they're asked a question about their weakness or challenges,
Mm,
how can they answer that question in a way that's positive and constructive?
definitely. And I don't think a student needs to distort or lie. Definitely don't do that in the interview. Many times we can tell when a student isn't being authentic. So you definitely want to be authentic. When it comes to weaknesses, I think the best way to go about it is to frame them as opportunities for growth. And in addition to that, can you explain to us maybe what steps the students has taken to improve? For example, you may mention I struggle with time management sometimes. However, recently I have started using a scheduling tool to be able to do that. And I'm now seeing improvements in my life, but it's still something that I'm working on improving. It's that's a weakness, but they framed it as an opportunity for growth, and they're showing us what steps they're taking to improve on it as well. So I think that's a good way to answer that question in a constructive and positive way.
If a student is ever too nervous and they fumble on your questions or they struggle to answer a question, would that affect the entire interview process in general? Would it affect admission into the university?
No, I definitely don't think it would impact their admission. I think many students are nervous at times. We don't expect anyone to be not nervous. I think it's normal. Some ways that they can potentially address that is they can sometimes even acknowledge that, right? I've had students just say, hey, I'm really nervous right now. And then they'll just laugh it off. And that I think acknowledging that you're nervous to the interviewer can also help lighten the mood and make the whole situation a little bit easier. A part of acknowledging that maybe if you're nervous, I think some things that can also help is just deep breathing exercises. I think those can help. Just take it easy. Arrive early or on time so that you're not stressed out about being late, so you can settle into the environment. So I think those things can also help as well. And I would also I just channel that nervousness into energy and show excitement, enthusiasm. Right, and that can help as well.
When a student is, I think Sometimes they struggle with talking about themselves or fear coming off as bragging. So, do you have any
Mm.
advice on how can they highlight their strengths without sounding arrogant?
Honestly, I can't think of any real interviews where I really felt the student was being arrogant. I think if they're excited and proud to share their achievements with us, right? If they show that authenticity, I think that can really help remove any of that kind of feeling that someone may get. If you talk about how you feel, how happy you felt, or the amount of hard work you've put into a project, for example, and I can tell you, what I would ask students, something I would say, hey, this is an opportunity for you to brag about yourself. So go
Mhm.
for it. So I can't really think of many cases where I felt a student was being arrogant. Many times students are just genuinely speaking about their achievements.
When a student comes to an interview, have you have any experiences about maybe that surprised you in a bad or good way? Any stories to share with us?
I think I have a couple. One that comes to the top of my mind is one time there was a student that was wearing like breakdancing clothes. They were in the full gear with a chain and a cap and everything. So they really stood out. I think that's something that once happened. I've had an applicant who came right after going to the gym. So they were still in their gym clothes and they were still sweating. So I think those are things that have happened. I've had parents sometimes asking to sit in on the interview. So we have to tell them, hey, sorry, it's just going to be me and the student. You can't come in. Or sometimes the opposite. Sometimes the student has asked for the parent to sit in. Again, that's not going to happen. So many different type of things do happen. I think it's normal, but some of these things I think can easily be avoided. You want to be memorable, but in a positive way, not necessarily in a negative way.
Yeah. So I guess the dressing part of it is very important too, right? To make a good impression. But you don't really have to wear a suit and tie, right? You can just wear business
Right.
casual.
You don't need to like overdress, I think, but you don't also want to be underdressed. So yeah, just wear business casual. If someone wants to wear a suit and a tie, then I think that's fine as well. Or if somebody wants to wear a coat or other formal tie, that's fine as well. I don't think that's a huge issue. But you definitely don't want to be walking in like your dance clothes or like your gym
Yeah.
shorts or things like that.
Yeah. I'm surprised that students actually do that. But
You'd be surprised. That's one of the great things, by the way. I really love doing interviews because you get to meet so many different types of people. Every single student is unique. That's one advice I would give a student is that you don't need to try to be someone that you're not. Be authentic to yourself. You don't need to pretend. You don't need to like make up things. Just be authentic and genuine and passionate.
speaking of making a lasting impression, what is the one key thing students can do to stand out in an interview, even if they don't have the perfect grades or extensive list of extracurriculars?
So I think there's a few different things that they can do here. One, that I mentioned, is to show passion, right? If they show like energy and passion towards what they want to study, that can really maybe set them apart from some other students who may have the grades, but then they don't necessarily have that same energy, right? Universities want students who can be active on campus. They'll be adding to the community. So being able to show that you're that type of person, that can really help. Demonstrating other qualities like resilience or providing unique perspectives on things. Or let's say you've overcome certain challenges, you can speak about those. So students have many different ways to highlight their different strengths. Not every single student is going to have the perfect transcript or the perfect testing scores, for example. Each student does have unique experiences that they can talk about. If a student is involved in the community and they've made impact in certain places, they've held leadership positions, for example, those are all really good things to talk about that can really enhance the interview.
I know that interviews can go both ways where the interviewer would ask the student questions and then vice versa. Are there different types of questions that admissions officer would be impressed that the student actually asked them?
You should have some questions prepared for the interviewer as well, because typically we'll ask a student at the end, do you have any questions for me? And if you don't have any questions, I think that's maybe it's not the greatest interview, right? If that's just you just say, no, I don't have any questions, right?
Mm.
If you want to show genuine interest in a college, you can definitely ask a few different questions. So to give you an example of some of those, there isn't like one specific question that would be really impressive, but asking questions about like campus life, about activities on campus, about research opportunities, anything about an academic program, any questions that you may have you want to get clarified. If it's an alumni interviewing you, you can ask them about their personal experience at the university. Once they graduated, what was life like that after that, right? So
Mhm.
you just want to show genuine interest in the person interviewing you and in the institution as well.
Is there a distinct difference between an alumni interview versus an interview with an admissions officer? Is there a difference between that, or is it pretty much the same?
There are some differences in terms of like when an admissions person is interviewing a student, they're coming in with several years of experience of being in a committee on seeing how students are evaluated in an admissions office. So the way they're conducting themselves is with all of that experience and background. An alumni may not necessarily understand what goes on in admissions committee, right? So a lot of times alumni interviews are really the informational type of interviews that we discussed earlier, where they're less
Mhm.
formal. It's a way for a student to learn more about the university. And an alumni will offer their evaluation, but it could be different from a way an admissions person would do that evaluation. So there's some nuances there, but ultimately they both help play a role in enhancing the student's application.
Now, let's talk about common myths and misconceptions. I know there's a lot of misinformation out there on the internet and people just discussing on like Reddit threads. What are some of the common
Right.
myths about college interviews that students should stop worrying about?
The one thing I think sometimes people think is that the interview is just going to make or break the decision, right? I think that is not necessarily true. It's not even true for the most part. They're just one part of the application, right? Can they negatively impact an application? I used to say to students, I don't think it negatively impacts the admission decision, but if you do well in an interview, it can definitely have a positive impact on the admission decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That if a student doesn't do so well, that's fine. They didn't do so well. There's still like their transcripts and their extracurriculars. It's just one part of the process. One thing that you mentioned earlier is about being nervous. Like I said, it's okay to be nervous. It doesn't necessarily reflect poorly on the student. We just want you to be yourself. Another myth is sometimes students think that we're really looking for someone who's perfect. No one's perfect, right? We all have our own flaws. What we're really looking for is a good fit between the student and the university. We're looking for the strengths that you're bringing and how you're overcoming maybe your weaknesses and different challenges that you may have in your life. And also, you don't need to have an answer for everything necessarily. You may not know something, right? So being honest and authentic is more important here. If you don't know something, feel free to say, I don't know. Let me think about it. Maybe you can ask me in a different way, or just take it easy, I would say. Don't stress out about it too much.
Some final questions before we wrap up. Do you have any other like funny or maybe the most memorable stories that impressed you during a college interview?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of the most memorable interviews are about students who have unique stories to tell. For example, I remember once a student told me about how they adopted a blind dog and how all the challenges that came with that and how they maybe overcame that. So that's a pretty sort of unique story. It could be a really challenging life situation. I remember one student once showed me their hand and a finger was missing on their hand. And then I was like, oh, what's the story behind that? And it turns out that their dad had gifted them like a sports car when they were like still 18 or something. And then the first day they crashed it. They had a serious accident. They were 6 months in a hospital. He lost a finger in that accident. And now that same student was going to different schools and talking about driving safety and things like
Mhm.
that. Those are some there's many other unique stories I think that are out there. So stories that are unique to you, which highlight a challenge that you faced, I think those make interviews really memorable. In addition to that, I'll say this again, it's the passion. How passionate a student is about what they want to study can really make a difference. Students that are running their own businesses or running their own ventures, those are quite impressive things, for example, to talk about. So I would say unique experience and stories really do make an interview memorable.
So, for a final question, do you have any last minute tips for students preparing for their interviews soon? What's the one thing they should remember above all else?
It's not an obstacle, it's an opportunity to show your passion, show your personality. And I think you should be excited about being able to do that. Like I said, keep in mind, universities also want you. So you want to approach it in that manner and dress appropriately, keep your answers concise and to the point, be positive and express gratitude as much as you can. And also, one final tip I think is at the end of the interview, after everything's done, get the interviewer's contact details, email them, thank them later for meeting with you. And that's a way for you to be able to stay in touch with them, ask many questions in the future as well. And yeah, I think those are just some final tips that I can give.
Okay, perfect. I think that's all of the questions that I have. Thank you so much for being here with us again. I'm sure our listeners are going to learn so much. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I had a great time speaking with you. And yeah, I hope students do learn from what I was able to offer. And thank you so
Okay.
much.
And that is a wrap for today's episode. A huge thank you to Mustafa for sharing his expert insights on the college interview process. I hope that you're feeling more confident and ready to tackle any interview that comes your way. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a comment, and let us know what other topics you'd like to hear from us here on the podcast. If you have any questions, let us know. All of the contact information are in the description below. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.